Greetings. It's nice to be back here with you again. Welcome to the Richard Dolan Show, where every week we fight the good fight. I've been gone for a little while, and you will notice a slight difference to the background here. You might also detect a little bit of an echo in this room. You may or may not, I'm not sure. And that is because Tracy and I have been busy this last month, and one of the nice results is that I have a new office. So I'm very happy about that. I like the paint color. It's all looking good. I don't yet have all of my books transferred in here, and so I think that will do a lot of sound deadening, honestly, when I get that whole thing moved in. But we've been very busy. And if you've wondered, why hasn't Richard been doing many videos lately, that is why. So I'm glad to be back. I do expect and hope that I'll be on more of a regular schedule. If you followed me for any period of time, you know I'm one of these, well, I come out there every once in a while. I'll do a video maybe once this week, maybe twice in a week, but sometimes once every couple of weeks. I can't guarantee you what my schedule will be, but I am back. I will be here, and I'm glad to be back with you. So that's all that's good. Now, there's always a lot to talk about and a lot to discuss, but one thing that, I keep falling back to is that the in our current conversation about UAP, or once called UFOs, that there's a lot of exciting things happening about it. We talk about Congress and upcoming hearings and whistleblowers coming out here and there and sometimes everywhere. And it is all relevant. It's all important. We want to know about these things. But I am continually struck by more and more by the fact that I think we are just ignoring and actually even forgetting our actual history. And particularly the early years of this phenomenon, when it exploded, it erupted into our consciousness in the late 1940s. Prior to 2017, prior to when you could say that the New York Times helped us to reboot our UFO conversation. Prior to that, I think it was pretty much a given among all of us who were following this subject that, yeah, the 1940s was very important, and we discussed it quite a lot. I've always been discussing it ever since I've been involved in this, but I'm certainly not the only one. Lots of individuals, lots of folks have focused on that because it is important. And if you forget your history, you are in danger of not knowing where you're going. So I've always felt that looking at the early period is important for a lot of reasons. And I'm not really even trying to cast aspersions over contemporary researchers who do not talk about the history. Not everyone knows the history very well. That's one thing. And then there's also the added incentive, or at least desire for most people to wonder, well, I don't care about what happened back then. I want to know what's going on now. And, we all get that. We all understand that. But I will maintain that we are in grave danger if you actually believe in something like disclosure, if you actually believe in openness on the subject of UAP or UFOs, you want to know what that early history says. You want to know that because, frankly, when this phenomenon exploded in the late 40s, that is what has given us the foundation for everything we're talking about today. And not only that, but just on a purely dramatic level, I don't think that we've ever surpassed the sheer drama and rapidity of events that took place, let's say, from the late 40s to the very early 1950s. All the periods of the UFO subject in the modern era are important. They all have something to tell us. But the late 40s, early 50s, I think really are especially so. So what I'm going to do, very simply, is just let's walk through. Now, there's a lot of things that I'm sure if you're a listener, if you've followed me or other researchers for any period of time, you probably know a lot of the things I'm going to talk about, but I will bet you may have forgotten some of the things that I'm going to discuss. And for many of you, a lot of this may be brand new, for all I know. So it's never a good idea just to assume that we all know this, all the stuff that happened in the past. It's important and we want to know it, so I want us to get into it now. So one thing to say about the modern UFO phenomenon is that it did not creep in. It basically detonated right in our faces. And that image, that man right there, that is Kenneth Arnold. Many of you have heard his name. He was a private pilot in 1947 out in the state of Washington, and he was actually looking for a reward for regarding a military plane crash, and he's flying over around Mount Rainier in Washington and sees 9 of these objects that's depicted here in the inset there, kind of a bat wing shaped object. So not a flying saucer. It was, at least from Arnold's perspective, they kind of looked like that. He saw 9 of them. He was a very excellent witness, Kenneth Arnold was, a very meticulous, careful person who happened to know the distance between 2 of the peaks in that mountain range and did his best to calculate the speed by which the objects passed from one peak to another. And based on that calculation, and this was his conservative calculation, he estimated they were moving at around 1,200 miles per hour. In 1947, nothing in the air was moving at that kind of a speed. So he went back, got landed, he made his report, and the press just exploded with these flying saucers. And as you may know, they got that name because Arnold himself described them as like saucers skimming on the water. So they were flying saucers. And what we know, and many researchers have studied this in a lot of detail, there were thousands of sightings in 1947, and many. I've written at times, I thought maybe thousands of sightings by trained military observers. That's possible. Definitely hundreds at the very least by trained military observers in 1947 alone. Could be thousands. One of the interesting things about what happened in the summer of 47 is that you have a major response by the media, that is newspapers and radio at that time, but also by the United States military. It was kind of a parallel surge in interest. So that's a kind of interesting thing to say and to recognize. What we can see is that the United States military took these objects very seriously, and in fact, I would say far more seriously than they were admitting to the public at the time. But even back at the time, it was being widely reported by newspapers that the U.S. military was following this and wondering, were these the Russians, or was this some kind of secret project that we have going on? Exact same questions back then that we ask today, frankly. When you think of the mystery drones from a little over a year ago, same kinds of questions. Is it a foreign nation? Is it the Iranians? Is it the Chinese? The Russians? Or is it some secret thing that we're working on? Same questions were occurring in 1947 regarding these flying saucers, as they were being called back then. But the phenomenon really exploded. That's probably one of the main things to keep in mind here. But the other thing is that it created a kind of national security shockwave. So you get this initial panic, and what I have here are a couple of clips of the famous memo by 3-star General Nathan Twining of the United States Air Force. Twining went on to get his 4th star and became Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force. He was a major player in the U.S. Air Force in 1947 and later. And, one of the things that Twining wrote in September of 1947 is that this phenomenon is not visionary or fictitious. It was real. And he also, in this memo, this is to another general, where he was responding to a query by this general about these objects, Twining also delineated a number of factors about these discs, these objects, all of which were interesting, and one that I've underlined here, number 3, circular or elliptical in shape, flat on bottom, and domed on top. You just stop and ask yourself, this is 1947, where Twining is talking about this. And we really need to ask, what would be flat on bottom and domed on top? That surely sounds like, potentially, like a flying saucer, one of the classic disc-shaped saucers that people have reported for decades and decades. Well, could be. I think very likely that is what we are talking about. He mentioned a lot of other factors: silent, evasive upon being sighted, exceptional maneuverability, and a lot of things like that. So that was an interesting thing. But the Twining memo was just part of the response. We had military bases going on alert with regularity. We had overflights over all kinds of military bases that were just left the intelligence officers scratching their heads. As far as we can tell, they did not have an answer to this. Something big seems to have exploded, and which involved a lot of the U.S. military bases. So when people, this goes to today, they'll say, well, why are we focusing on the military and talking about potential threats and all that? Isn't that just fear-mongering? Well, it could be fear-mongering. I wouldn't say that that's impossible, but it is undeniable that these overflights by these unknown objects of exceptional capabilities that did not look anything like anything we had in our inventory, that these were a genuine military matter, and they were a potential threat. How could they not be? You have objects coming in, hanging out over very sensitive installations with regularity. Yes, of course the military is going to be interested. One of the main factors that got me interested in studying this subject over 30 years ago now was the fact that I knew that these were engaging the United States military. And why was that important? Well, it was important because the U.S. government has, to this day, by the way, but especially back in the 20th century when I started looking at this, has consistently denied that there's anything to these UFOs, that they were not interested. They had no interest. Especially, I started in the early 1990s, and that was absolutely the rule by the government, any government statement. So for me, from my perspective, I'm thinking government's denying that they have any interest in this, and yet we have case after case after case of our military pilots chasing these things and failing. What's wrong with this picture? So I do think, and I continue to believe, that understanding the military dimensions of the UAP or UFO phenomenon is critical. And I think it's wrong to simply dismiss any military person who says, well, these are potential threats. Military people are paid to assess potential threats. Like, that's what they do. So why are you going to criticize someone for doing what his job is? But B, it's also, frankly, it's a legit thing to say. Like, it's a legitimate concern for any military person to look at these objects. You don't know who they belong to. That is, by definition, a potential threat. Potential. Doesn't mean real. We don't know. But anyway, that's all I want to say for that. What we know in the late 1940s is that there was a major institutional response to these objects. A lot of scrambling. Army, Air Force. This is before even the convergence of all the military branches into the Department of Defense. The Navy, the Army itself, the FBI, the CIA, I'll get into that in a little while. So all of them were interested in this. All of them there was this flurry of activity and people wondering, what is this? What is going on? We have the documents to indicate this. We know that in response to Twining's memo, which I have indicated here, that something known as Project Sign was created at the very end of 1947, beginning of 1948, with very serious intentions. And this was not a debunking effort. This was an urgent intelligence priority for these scientists in Project Sign to study this phenomenon, to study the reports, and to come up with a conclusion. And what we know about Project Sign is that things got to be pretty darned intense. By the summer of 1948, there was a very significant sighting involving a commercial aircraft and an object zipping directly in its field of vision and then zooming up. Absolutely an insane sighting, but the pilots were both extremely good observers. They were both extremely consistent in what they described, and it was impossible to ignore. And so the Project Sign team did come up with a conclusion. I'm going to get to that in just a moment. But before I do that, there were other things happening in 1947. And that, of course, deals with crashes. And everyone knows about Roswell. If there's one thing in UFO history that people today might know about with 1947, it would be Roswell, right? Well, Roswell has been talked to death during the 1980s, during the 1990s, into the early 2000s. You can kind of get a sense that people want to be done with Roswell. At least this is my own sense of the matter. I think that would be a very big mistake. I think Roswell remains an extremely important case. There's an image of Jesse Marcel, of course, made, unfortunately for him, to look like a fool for the press and holding up a piece of a tattered weather balloon, which he always maintained, this was not what we saw on the Foster Ranch when I was ordered to go and look at the debris of something that crashed there. He said, no way. He brought back the pieces, many of the pieces in his Jeep. He showed them in the middle of the night as he got home to his family, including his 11-year-old son, Jesse Jr., who went on to be a doctor and an Army colonel, and totally, completely supported his dad's story for the rest of his life. And all of that led to the Army press release. We've essentially recovered a flying disc. That was retracted almost immediately. We get the weather balloon cover story, and that's Marcel right there. Major aftershocks to what happened at Roswell. You have witnesses being silenced. You have documents vanishing. You know, back in the early 1990s when the U.S. Congress formally engaged in a renewed investigation of the Roswell event, they discovered, after all this obfuscation by the military, that for more than a year, the key documents out of Roswell Army Airfield were missing from the end of 1946 through the beginning of 1948 or 49, all gone. And these were documents, of course, this would have given us a very clear idea, like phone calls, any other kinds of written documentation out of Roswell. All of it gone. All of it. We learned this in 1995. Those are documents that should never have been destroyed, and they were destroyed without any reason given. They were just gone. So it was very, very suspicious. So you have witnesses being silent, documents disappearing. You see the secrecy locking down immediately. And by the way, in addition to Roswell, there has been very good research by many other civilian researchers that have identified other suspected retrievals. Many people know about the Aztec case from 1948, Aztec, New Mexico, Kingman, Arizona in early 1953 as well. Personally, I think both of those cases are strong. We're going back in time here. We're looking at a lot of the witnesses. They're no longer with us. But the statements, the information often is very, very specific. And I think these are good cases. The implication, whether with Roswell or with these other potential crafts, we've heard Paola Harris and Jacques Vallée not long ago talk about the Trinity crash, potentially from 1945. There's the potential event at Cape Girardeau, Missouri from 1941. And of course, we've been hearing quite a bit lately about the Italian crash, northern Italy in 1933 from the late Harold Malmgren. I think all of these are potentially strong cases. The unfortunate aspect for some of them may be that it may be impossible at this point with document destruction and the silencing of witnesses, that we will ever get an absolute, 100% confirmed yes to these crashes and these retrievals. But I do think if you smell enough smoke, you should suspect that there's fire going on. And that is certainly, I think, what a reasonable mind should likely conclude. I think that would be the best, most logical conclusion here. Something came down, and I don't think we can say it was weather related. I think that's probably fair enough. So So all of that was happening. That's just 1947, 1948. I mentioned there's repeated unauthorized overflights over U.S. bases. You have multiple scrambles. Some of these were very sensitive installations. We're talking about the Hanford nuclear facility in the state of Washington, where they were manufacturing plutonium. Very important stuff in the late 40s. Oak Ridge nuclear facility in Tennessee, where a tremendous amount of research related to nuclear technology was being done. Los Alamos National Labs, same thing in New Mexico. All of these areas were scenes to bizarre, exotic-looking craft that had exceptional maneuverability, exceptional evasive capabilities, did not look like airplanes. They didn't have the standard fuselage and wings. They looked like flying discs most of the time, and they got a lot of high-level attention from senior U.S. government scientists and military officials. I'm not going to go all of the details. I have done a lot of deep dives on many of these things. You can go through my previous videos on YouTube, and you'll find a lot there. There's much to say here. This went through 48, 1949, 1950, 1951. All of those were dense years of sightings, and not simply military. I'm focusing on the military aspect at the moment, but many, many ordinary people were seeing these things. And also, it must be said, not simply in the United States, but in almost every other part of the world, even by the late 40s, early 50s. We have more information and more attention inevitably seems to be given to the American aspect of this, but that is by no means the full story here. In my study of USOs, which is ongoing, last few weeks I'm almost wrapping up that second volume, by the way, and it just kind of got put on hold, but that is happening. But when you look at the early period of USOs, that is water-based UAP, that's totally global. That is also not confined in any way to the United States or its U.S. territories. It's global. And then we get to 1952, where this phenomenon does become very intense over the United States, over the entire United States, highlighted, I would say, in the minds of our collective memory by the airspace violations over Washington, D.C. in late July of 1952. This had a national response in terms of media attention. We had, in fact, it's fascinating to go back through the histories of that whole period. And I'll mention Edward Ruppelt in just a moment, but in his famous book, Report on Unidentified Flying Objects, Ruppelt was very much involved in following the 1952 wave of sightings. And that includes being with the air traffic controllers on the nights where this event was happening. Ruppelt actually said, the people in the traffic controller probably mostly believed that this was where the whole secret was going to come out, that it was impossible to contain simply on the basis of the drama of that night. But of course, things continued to be contained indeed. But we had all kinds of military engagements throughout that year, not just Washington, D.C. Pilots were frequently being ordered to intercept and sometimes lost. A few years back in 1948 was the famous Mantell incident. Thomas Mantell pursued what he believed was a metallic disc-shaped object that ended in his crash and his death. Here's Edward Ruppelt and his book, Report on Unidentified Flying Objects. So let me back up a little bit again. I was talking about the Project Sign team and their study of this, and I mentioned that in the summer of 1948, there had been a major sighting by some commercial pilots. That led the Sign team to conclude that these objects were most likely interplanetary. That was the word they were using. And this report was called the Estimate of the Situation. Edward Ruppelt, who headed Project Blue Book in the early 1950s, wrote about this. And he said, this is what happened. That document, he said, the estimate that they wrote was destroyed, allegedly. He said maybe a couple of copies still exist, but this was an internal report concluding these objects were most likely from another planet, that is, aliens, or as we like to say in our sanitized language today, NHI, non-human intelligence. Fine, whatever floats your boat. But this document was brought to high-level military officers, and including the then Air Force Chief of Staff, General Hoyt Vandenberg, who had a very negative reaction to this document, according to Ruppelt, and said, I don't like this conclusion. He broke up the SIGN team, had them all reassigned, scattered them to the winds. And what Ruppelt then described is that you see this culture shift within the part of the Air Force that was studying this. So Project SIGN became called Project Grudge. And we're talking, this is 1949, 1950. New policy, debunk, dismiss, just pure public relations management, because doing anything else was going to become a real problem that clearly they would not have known how to handle this. Now, here's a little, I think all too little appreciated, but virtually certain aspect of our UFO history, which is that President Harry Truman, starting from the summer of 1948 to the end of his presidency, so starting, in other words, from when the estimate of the situation landed on Vandenberg's desk, from that time, he received quarterly UFO briefings from this man pictured next to him, who's shaking his hand, and that is General Robert B. Landry. Landry started with Truman as a colonel and promoted to, I think this image here has him promoted to Brigadier General, 1 star, and then he ended up as a Major General with 2 stars. Landry was a very significant man. So now Harry Truman died in the early 1970s, and shortly after Truman's death, Landry was still alive and he was interviewed for an oral history interview. I wrote about this in my very first book, UFOs in the National Security State, Volume 1. And you could read Landry's interview. It's public domain. It's not difficult to find any longer. So there was a person interviewing him just about the general course of his career, Korean War and the Berlin airlift and all this other stuff that he was involved in during those years in the late 40s, early 50s. And then, crazy thing, the interviewer at the very end of this interview asks Landry, hey, what about UFOs? Did you and the president have anything to do with that? That was a question that came out of nowhere. It's really interesting to read the transcript here. Landry, it seems that he had to think a little bit about that. But his answer was, oh, well, yes, actually, the president, like any ordinary citizen, was interested in these alleged reports of these, exotic objects and so forth, and he wanted to know, just like anyone would. Well, no, not just like anyone would. Harry Truman was president of the United States. A little more important for him to know about this. So what Landry said to this interviewer was that, yes, in the summer of 1948, I was asked to meet with the president, and my job was to be the U.S. Air Force liaison to Harry Truman on the matter of flying saucers, or UFOs. And not only that, he was charged with coordinating his briefings, quarterly briefings, that's every 3 months, to coordinate with CIA for those briefings. Now, the interviewer said, wow, that's pretty interesting indeed. Anything come out of that? And Landry was very quick to say, well, no, there was no actionable intelligence here. And he hastened to say that there were no written reports. Everything was made orally, which made me think of a statement by a former CIA director, Richard Helms, who once said, first rule in keeping secrets is nothing on paper. But be that as it may, Landry said, yeah, these weren't important enough to be written reports. Everything was just made orally. And we certainly had no reports that made us be concerned for U.S. national security. To which anyone who studied the least bit of UFO history from the late 40s to the early 50s would have to call BS on that statement. Some of the most dramatic, incredible encounters by military pilots with UFOs were made during this time. We know all about them, many of them through declassified documents that we only learned about in the mid and late 1970s. So when Landry gave his interview, this was just before the Freedom of Information Act era really took off with UFOs. So he was able to get away with this statement, essentially saying, yeah, well, we did the briefings, but nothing was all that important, and it just kind of went away. But here's the other thing. Those briefings, according to Landry, lasted through the remainder of Harry Truman's presidency. So from the summer of 48 to January of 1953, that is 4.5 years. So depending on how you do your math, that's either 16 or maybe as many as 18 briefings of the President of the United States on flying saucers. Now, you ask yourself, Harry Truman was a busy man. During that period of time, you had the Berlin airlift, and if you know your history, that was a very important event. You had the outbreak of war in Korea starting in 1950. You had all kinds of major labor union issues, domestic strikes, and all of these things happening that were demanding a lot of Truman's attention. To say nothing of the fact that he ran a re-election campaign in the fall of 1948. Through all of that and more, he's getting briefings on UFOs. Now, if that was a nonsensical topic, you got to ask yourself, why would the president be briefed quarterly on this subject if it's just nonsense? Well, clearly it's not nonsense, and that is why, according to Landry, Truman kept getting briefed on this every 3 months. So I think that's really quite a very interesting statement and something interesting to remember, that the President of the United States, confirmed by his Air Force liaison, received quarterly briefings on UFOs. Another interesting thing to happen during 1948 and 1949 was the death of this man in May of 1949. That, of course, was the very first U.S. Secretary of Defense. His name was James Forrestal. He's a famous man. They named an aircraft carrier after him and a lot of other things. Forrestal we know we have some confirmed interest by Forrestal in the matter of these flying saucers. There are some documents that track back to his office on this. And of course, how could he not? He was Secretary of Defense during this period of time. Obviously, he was one of the key point men that would have to deal with this. The thing about Forrestal is that, during all of this period of massive explosion of UFO sightings and these dramatic reports, this man jumps to his death out of the 16th floor of the Bethesda Naval Hospital, which you see pictured in this image here. Now, officially, Forrestal's death was a suicide, a very strange suicide, if that was. But of course, many people believed right away, a number of people believed that that was not a suicide. He was suicided. He was murdered. I have always believed that that was the case. Again, I wrote about this in some detail in my very first book on the subject, Volume 1 of UFOs in a National Security State. Suffice to say, I think the case is a very strong one, that he was probably murdered. Keep in mind that his death was 14 years before the John F. Kennedy assassination, and took place in a time where no one in the United States was ever going to question a statement coming out of the U.S. military. This is the military that had just won the Second World War. They were revered. So if the Navy probe on this said, well, it was a suicide, no one was going to dispute that at the time. But there's a lot of suspicious things about it. Now, a UFO connection may or may not be relevant in the case of Forrestal's death. There are a lot of other factors involved. Cold War factors or Middle East factors involved. These potentially may have factored in. If you're going to wonder why would the man have been murdered, there are reasons other than simply the UFO one to be there. But I think it would be grossly negligent to ignore the UFO aspect of this. That is really the elephant in the room of the late 1940s. It's a thing that no one was able to talk about publicly as a motivation for anything, and yet we know this was a very serious national security issue, the matter of these flying saucers. So it's not impossible. The thing about Forrestal is that through 1948, the people who knew him best started to think that he was becoming a little bit unhinged. And you can read about this even in his official biographies. This is nothing outrageous to say here. And he started to complain about foreign-looking men following him. Probably true. So there were things happening here that tended to destabilize the Secretary of Defense. And it's not difficult to imagine that despite the fact that he seemed to be getting better in after his mental breakdown in spring of 1949, that when he was released, he could be a security risk. That is not a difficult thing to believe at all. There's much, much more, again, to say about Forrestal's death. I'm pretty sure I've done a video on it. If I'm only imagining that I've done a video on it, I'll have to come back and do a deep dive on that one, because it really does deserve one. So anyway, lots of questions about Forrestal's death, and that's just yet another thing to toss into the pile. Now, by the time you get to the early 50s, this phenomenon was becoming a very difficult, I would almost say unsolvable problem. There had been Project Grudge, which was ordered to debunk and dismiss, but the problem is, back then, as right through the mystery drones of just a year ago, whoever's operating these things never seemed to get the memo that they're not supposed to exist. So they keep coming. And in 1952, as I mentioned earlier, that was a big year. That got a lot of attention from the CIA. This man pictured here was named H. Marshall Chadwell. He was a deputy director of intelligence for the CIA in 1952. During that year, he wrote several memos on this matter of UFOs or flying saucers, many of which went to his boss, the director of the CIA, Walter Bedell Smith, very famous man. In December of 1952, Chadwell basically saying we're facing objects of undetermined origin. His actual quote, which I've highlighted there, lays it out pretty clearly. Sightings of unexplained objects at high altitude over sensitive installations, at speeds and altitudes that are of such nature that they do not appear to be natural phenomena or known types of aerial vehicles, is what he says there. That's a very bureaucratic and safe way of saying, boss, it looks like we might be invaded here. Just saying. Seems like that to me. It's a very, very upfront, bold statement coming from the director of scientific intelligence at the CIA to his boss. Chadwell had a number of possibilities that he was floating out there. This might be some kind of psychological warfare risk, or worse. He did not talk about aliens per se in his memo, but when you read his words carefully, it's impossible to dismiss them, and it's easy to read between the lines as well. So that led to probably the last bit of house cleaning of the entire presidency of Harry Truman, which was known as the Robertson Panel. And this took place during the last weekend that Harry Truman was president. Again, it's kind of forgotten in our history. So all through the late 40s and early 50s, when the flying saucers and UFOs basically exploded into our consciousness, there was one American who was president the whole time. That was Harry Truman. And there was this very nice consistency if you're going to be managing this project, this problem. And, if you're managing the problem, you probably want that consistency. But by the end of 1952, it was obvious Truman was going to be out, and a new guy was coming in. That was Dwight Eisenhower. Not just a new person, but of the opposite party, the Republican Party. I think Eisenhower was certainly considered to be a reliable individual, but still, think about it. If you're in the Truman administration and you see these new guys coming in, you might just want to button down this subject as tightly and as securely as you can. And so I've always felt that the rush at the end of 1952 to get some kind of panel to adjudicate over this was in part a race against the clock before Truman actually left the White House. So indeed, during the last week or weekend of the Truman administration, we have something known as the Robertson Panel, led by a man named H.P. Robertson. And this, we now know, this is not a matter of debate anymore, that the fundamental conclusions of the Robertson Panel were in the tank before they even met. And it was to demystify and essentially debunk the subject of these flying saucers. You have people like J. Allen Hynek, who was a consultant to the Air Force at the time, Edward Ruppelt, who I mentioned earlier. They both wrote about this, and at the time they were both kind of mystified as to why the Robertson Panel seemed so dismissive of all this really great evidence that they had presented to the panel. Well, we know why. We know why because this team of Nobel-caliber scientists were nonetheless essentially mandated to put this whole thing to sleep. One of their suggestions, if we can call them suggestions or recommendations, was not simply to formalize censorship over this subject. That was absolutely one of the things that they said. It's like, well, we need to work with major media, such as Walt Disney, very, very big then and now, to take the joy, take the thrill out of this and to educate the public properly on this, basically to debunk. To declare these objects unimportant. They were of no great concern whatsoever. And also they recommended espionage, essentially spying on the civilian organizations in the United States that were studying the subject, including the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, APRO, which had just gotten started in the kitchen of Coral and James Lorenzen, but they were starting to put out their newsletter already, and they were getting some traction. Robertson Panel noted them, as well as another organization at the time, which didn't last much longer after that, CSI, Civilian Saucer Investigation. Good organization, they just didn't last very long. They were noted in the Robertson Panel report. So very interesting. So this was on the civilian side, but then within the military, what Edward Ruppelt noted as a result of the Robertson Panel is that essentially the Project Blue Book, which was the successor to Project Grudge, and which was the investigative body of all of these flying saucers, that whole thing was gutted. Under Ruppelt, Blue Book may not have had all of the status that, its members might have wanted. Undoubtedly, there was deeper and more important investigations going on. But you can definitely say that under Ruppelt, Project Blue Book was a legitimate attempt to investigate this phenomenon. That certainly is what comes through to me. But after that, the staff was gutted, and they became very, very immediately, orders came through to explain away, not to explain, but to explain away all of these reports. And that's when you start seeing the percentage of unknowns go from like 25% every year down to 5%, then down to 3%, then down to 2%, with any kind of explanation that they could come up with to explain these things. So here's a nice picture of Presidents Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, and John F. Kennedy. It was all that was a long time ago, those men when they were alive. It really leads to a question: how much do presidents know about this subject? And it's always a tricky topic. I mean, it's harder to know even today, perhaps, than if you go back 60, 70 years when these men were around. I would say that in the case of Harry Truman, certainly the impression that I've always had is that he was probably briefed more than any of the others. I think it's fair to say that Truman would have known everything that there is to know about this. Because he was president, he was on the spot when this exploded. And it's a weird thing about Truman because when he was president, especially during his first term, he was considered kind of a weak president. He was considered sort of just a placeholder. He came into the presidency when as vice president when Franklin Roosevelt died after just 1 year in office. Truman was not really considered a major player in D.C. politics. He was seen as a kind of a small town politician who just got lucky. But he was in charge, and the impression that one gets over and over again is that he was on the spot and that he did know. I suspect Harry Truman did get full briefings. We're still playing the guessing game here with a lot of this, but that is what it looks like to me. I would say something similar regarding President Eisenhower. But even with his presidency, you can start to see that the compartmentalization started to take effect during his presidency. What's definitely true is that a lot of things started slipping away from the presidency during Eisenhower's years in office. One thing that historians have talked about is not just UFOs, but nuclear, the nuclear response and the nuclear plan in case of a war with the Soviet Union. Eisenhower famously received a briefing on this in the very last year of his presidency and was absolutely horrified to know that the U.S. plan was essentially to obliterate the entire Soviet Union. I think that was a shocker of a moment for him. And in fact, I wouldn't be surprised at all if that were one of the main motivations that caused him to discuss the dangers of the military-industrial complex in his farewell speech to the American public in 1961. Although I could certainly see UFOs maybe being in his mind as well with that. We'll never know. But I think Eisenhower probably had a lot of information. After all, the Kingman UFO crash, assuming it did happen, that was May of 1953. Eisenhower was president at that time. And I find it very difficult to think that Eisenhower would not have known all about that if it occurred. I just have a difficult time thinking that he would not have known that. So I think Eisenhower knew pretty much everything that was going on. Then, of course, you got the rumors from 1954 over at Edwards Air Force Base, the supposed dental emergency where he disappeared for a couple of days, although amid significant rumors that there was much more going on. In fact, I definitely want to follow up with a really good treatment of the whole Eisenhower 1954 scenario. So stick around for that. That'll be another time, though. So but after Eisenhower, it gets a little tricky to really know how much did presidents know. If you look at some of the alleged and sometimes controversial majestic documents, it would appear that John F. Kennedy knew a number of things. There's the famous, again, controversial, but I tend to believe the Marilyn Monroe CIA document that discussed her as a problem one day before she died in August of 1952, where it was said that she had engaged in private conversations with President Kennedy about beings from outer space and so forth. I think that Kennedy, and there's other connections of Kennedy to this subject that make me think he probably did know a lot. After that, it becomes harder and harder to know, like Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, George Bush Sr., Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, Joe Biden, Donald Trump again. How much do these individuals know? I've once had a conversation with a man who was, I think, very well connected and very well plugged into some of this. His opinion was, this is back some years ago, that some presidents know more than others. Some are considered reliable by the insiders, others are not, and that it's not a given any longer that presidents are fully briefed on this. And I think that's probably the assessment that many researchers who've gone into this think. But again, we're dealing with a lot of opacity. We don't always know. So, and that leads me to a wondering about, if it's not the president, then what are we talking about? In fact, during that conversation I had with this gentleman some years ago, I asked him point blank, I said, well, if presidents don't always know, who are we talking about here? I said, are we talking like the Bilderbergers, some kind exotic, private organization of people controlling it. And all he said was, yeah, that's probably about right. And that leads me to thoughts of a potential breakaway civilization. This is something I've talked about many, many times over many years. Other people have talked about this as well. It's an interesting idea. I developed this idea more than 15 years ago. And I mean, I guess the idea still remains. Think of it as an equation. Deep, deep secrecy plus acquired exotic technology, that is like flying saucer technology, plus virtually unlimited funding through black budgets. Well, ask yourself what could be done with something like that. You have a system that would be very well hidden from public control. And, talking about this type of thing back in the 1950s and 60s and 70s would have been virtually impossible. The public conversations back then did not go anywhere close to recognizing the deep levels of secrecy that I think we understand to be the case today. So it's a little easier now. But, I often wonder, well, I do believe in some version of a breakaway civilization. How far it goes, that's the real magical question, isn't it? Do they have, you think about it. It's like if you've got a team of classified scientists working in deeply, deeply embedded secrecy on flying saucer tech, would they, if they had a eureka moment where some genius scientist said, oh my gosh, I just figured out how we can do some kind of anti-gravitic effect here, or generate power using this method here, or, come up with your own discovery. Would that be translated to the rest of the world, or would it remain hidden? That is the question. Some things might be segued to the public and private sectors so you can make a lot of money off of it. I mean, there's all kinds of monetization here that can go on, and you have to assume people want to make a lot of money doing this. But it's still possible that some of these breakthroughs would be considered too important to allow the rest of the world to know about. And one of those could very well be some kind of anti-gravitic technology. If that is the case, you could imagine then this classified world kind of going far, far ahead of the rest of us in its own, research, and then classifying the research and basically making some of these things illegal and off limits for civilian researchers. And, could they develop flying saucers, off-world technology? I understand that's a lot of speculation there, but I think we're entitled to a little bit of speculation here. When you smell the smoke, you've got to wonder, where's the fire? So I think it's reasonable to at least speculate that this is possible. And then, of course, if they're able to go off-world in one way or another, you have to ask, what other things might they have learned that the rest of us don't know about? It would be as if a civilization, a mini civilization, is broken away from our own, hence a breakaway civilization. Not impossible. And by the way, you get echoes in some of the insiders of today. People like David Grush or Christopher Mellon or Luis Elizondo or Matthew Brown or many of the others. I think some of the things that they say align very eerily with the precedents from the 1940s and 50s, seems to me, in terms of potential breakaway type group and the runaway secrecy, the industrial intelligence partnerships like with Rand and Lockheed. All of that, I think the foundation for this was all laid in the 1940s and early 50s. All of the retrievals, the reverse engineering efforts, all of this happened in this very, very dense period. Basically, you're talking 5-6 years, the late 40s into the early 50s. Not a long period of time when so much happened, where the secrecy really kind of got laid down and gave us the world that we have today, which many other implications here. The undermining of the rule of law. Not that the UFO secret is the only thing that has undermined the rule of law in the United States, but it is one of those things. I have maintained for many years that students of government secrecy, U.S. government secrecy, all too frequently overlook the critical importance of the UFO phenomenon in that whole process. Yes, there was the needs of the Cold War and America developing its own empire, and the need for American regime change as they saw it around the world. And all of that required all kinds of secrecy and all kinds of covert shenanigans that they had to engage in that involved going around the authority of Congress and all of that. Yes. But also there were these UFOs, a very significant problem that they clearly did not want to fess up to, clearly that they did not feel that they were even remotely capable of discussing openly with the public. So they put themselves into this position. And then, the other thing about if you were to admit this in the late 40s and early 50s, what do you actually admit? Do you admit that some of these things seem to be real and we don't know what they are? Well, that's not a fun thing to say when you are pretending that you're the most powerful nation on earth and you've got everything under control. There's that. Then there's the other thing. Do you admit that you've acquired some of their technology? Well, if you do that, that becomes very hard to keep it to yourself then. Once you let the rest of the world know you've got some exotic alien tech that comes from another world, becomes a little more difficult to maintain security over it, right? And the last thing they wanted to do was to share that tech with other nations like the Russians, the Soviet Union, or anyone else for that matter. I think it's very obvious that those men running the American empire of the late 1940s thought, no, only us. We are the ones. We trust ourselves. We do not trust anyone else. We don't trust the public. We don't trust other nations. We trust ourselves. Maybe a couple of people from other nations who we can control. Okay, but that's it. And, whatever genius scientists that we need to bring into the program. Yes, and that's it. And I think that is really what happened. That is the system that was created in the late 1940s that exists to this day, I believe. And in fact, you can really look back and ask and answer a whole series of questions why this early era still matters today. You have all kinds of continuities from the late 40s with what we are dealing with today. The whole framing of these UAP or UFOs as aerospace threats or potential threats really began back then. Except publicly, the military kept trying to downplay it. Although privately, military people were constantly talking about these things as potential threats. All of that started 80 years ago. The whole secrecy rationale, the whole national security, the whole perceived desire to prevent public panic, all of that has been unchanged since the 1940s. The institutions then and now still avoid full transparency and openness. So a very, very important part of our history. And, I think, I said earlier here that I can understand to some extent, to a limited extent, why some of the people talking about this today gloss over the history. I think a lot just don't really know the history in that much detail. So there's that. But also I think that there's just this emphasis on the now, on today. But what I will never stop maintaining is that the early history matters a lot. It's actually really important. And if we forget this history, not just Roswell, I'm talking about everything else going on back then. It was an incredibly dramatic time where, a lot of knuckles were white, a lot of tension and stress and anxiety was going on over this. Hell, the Secretary of Defense jumped to his death or was thrown out of the window to his death in what was potentially related to this. And many other things were going on there. So the UFO cover-up did not evolve from nothing. It began in full force in the late 1940s. And so to understand any of the discussion that we're having today, this ultra slow motion disclosure, slow-mo disclose, you have to go back to the point of origin and see how this whole thing evolved really out of the gate. The deception, the lack of honesty coming from the government Whether we can criticize that or attempt to understand why there was a lack of honesty, it's really not hard to understand why the deception would have begun. I'm not saying it's right, but it's, we want to have understanding here. And when you are looking at men running an empire that requires them to control the levers of power, one thing they're not going to want to do is throw out a great destabilizing subject that just creates a whole mess of uncertainty for them. They don't want that. So that's really not hard to understand. The question that we have to ask ourselves now is not, is it true? Because it certainly seems true. And it's not even, is it right? Were they right to do that at the time? The question that I think we should be asking is, we all see the truth. We're all now in a situation where the U.S. government, to this day, treats its citizens like little children that don't deserve to know the truth. Well, it's our obligation as citizens to ask pertinent, intelligent questions and to bring as many facts to the table as we can. And because ultimately what we need for a healthy society is we need to get rid of this discrepancy between the official truth and the actual truth. It's like a schizophrenic society. You got this thing that you're supposed to believe in officially, but everyone kind of knows that official truth isn't really true. So we're living a lie. We're playing this game of pretend. And how can that be healthy for a society? So, and to say, let me close on this statement, assuming that this is a powerful, important subject of still unknown dimensions, which are potentially threatening, not just to militaries. We don't really know all of the dimensions of this phenomenon. There are people out there who say, oh no, I know for a fact they're wonderful space brothers and they're here to help us and help us elevate to the next fill in the blank. Maybe there's some that are like that. Are they all like that? Is everyone out there who may be observing us wonderful and beautiful and transparent and here to help? I don't know that that's really the most reliable thing to think. And then, I guess this is the last thing I'm going to say. When we look at exoplanetary capabilities from the perspective of our current technology, traveling through the stars just seems utterly impossible. We don't have the technology, at least officially, to allow us to do that. But I would say this, and this is one reason so many people are skeptical, and I can understand that. But if there is a way to deal with the distance problem, because that's really the big thing here, if there's a way to do it, and I don't know for sure that there's a way to do it, but it looks certainly like it's potentially possible, according to some people who've really spent a lot of time in studying this, if you solve the distance problem, you've essentially solved everything, haven't you? If you can get to here from there relatively easily, then well, there's really no difficulty in explaining these UFOs, is there? And then we are left asking, who are these guys? What is their agenda? What are they doing here? What is their interest in us? What is their interest in our world? Like, these are important questions to ask. And here's where you and I and everyone else has the right to ask about this and get an honest answer. I mean, this isn't the 1940s anymore. We're moving into a very, very different world. And, if we're ever going to get to wherever we're supposed to be getting to with all of this insane progress that we're involved in, technologically speaking, I think now would be a good time for a genuine disclosure. We're headed toward AGI, maybe. We're headed toward a lot of other massive transformations of our society. Maybe, just maybe, this is the time for some genuine honesty on the matter of UFOs. With that, I will thank you for spending this last hour here with me. It's been nice being back here with you again. Sorry it took so long, but I tried to explain why that was the case. I'll be back again soon. In the meantime, have a wonderful day wherever you are. And let's keep fighting the good fight. Later.